You're listening to One Feather, Two Pens. Lessons and stories from Indigenous peoples, building and navigating digital sovereignty. A special series on What's That Noise?
I'm joining you today from Winnipeg. So I want to take just a moment while I'm here to acknowledge that we're gathered on Treaty 1 territory. And those are the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, Red River Métis Nation. This land has been a meeting place for Indigenous people for thousands of years. Their teachings and stewardship have been essential in preserving these lands and waters, and just so fortunate to be here today to have this podcast with our friend Anita and you, Tommy, and that in many ways this podcast is a way of us dedicating ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation, particularly in this digital space, and how we have these conversations and how we do this business here. And I'm grateful for that opportunity to live and work and gather here in Winnipeg this time, away from home, from Victoria, but grateful to be here and affirm our commitment to all of our Indigenous leaders and communities and folks that follow us to continue to build respectful relationships with all the peoples of this land, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So where I come from, we say Gillikislam. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for the wonderful acknowledgement, Lawrence. It's really great to continue this conversation on digital indigeneity as we get deeper into 2024. I'm thinking back very recently to just a couple episodes ago where Lawrence, Al, and I reflected on the things that we'd been learning throughout the year. And one of those things was like this impending impression of artificial intelligence. And I think somewhere along the lines, we had to remind ourselves that as much as we can get lost and we can raise a lot of really tough questions about what's going on when we think about and we talk about digital indigeneity, that there's always an opportunity to continue learning if you're willing to listen. And this is something that JL really helped us with. We had a recent guest that did a wonderful job of reminding us to really think about the kind of stories that you can find if you're willing to listen. And that means that you're open to learning. And it just so happens that we're going to talk to somebody today that knows a lot about training. And this is another great opportunity.
Great segue.
Great natural segue indeed. To really continue listening to data and listen to people from Indigenous walks of life from coast to coast to coast so that we can continue advancing this really important conversation. And so I'm very, very grateful to introduce Anita Pawluk. And at this point, Anita, I would love for you to share more about yourself and your company. Thank you so much for joining us.
Definitely. Well, thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Lawrence and Tommy, for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. My name is Anita Pawluk. I'm a proud Métis woman from St. Louis, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory.
Oh, there you go.
Yes. And I'm currently president and co-founder and CEO of RaceRox, a training and modernization company that works in aerospace and defense. To date, our largest client is the Royal Canadian Navy. And over the last 14 years, we have delivered over 20 million in training systems. Wow. And through federal government programs, we've developed 17 million in R&D projects.
Oh my goodness. Wow. That's a lot of experience.
Not all of them have succeeded.
Wow. Fascinating. Yeah, I was really excited to learn more about RaceRox. And this is the first time, Lawrence, that we've had an opportunity to talk to somebody that not only works explicitly in like digital training. You know, we have had guests in the past that has worked in the education space, but is specifically in aerospace and defense. And this is really, really interesting.
I mean, the space you're in is so amazing and interesting. And can you share with us how you balance this technology and the work you do with Indigenous values and the project work that you do, and whatever that looks like for you? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, definitely. So how we at RaceRox, we actually transitioned from a non-Indigenous tech business over to an Indigenous tech business back in 2019. And that was also the same time that my mom and I went back to reclaim our Métis heritage. So it was a big learning curve, and I wanted to take the company along on the journey with me. Mm-hmm. And so to do that, we went through the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program through CCIB, the Canadian Council for Indigenous Businesses. that was a 3-year learning curve for me, where a lot of the time up front was spent unlearning all the stuff that we had learned in the Western world on how to communicate, on how to work together, how to make space, and how to ensure that people's voices were heard. Through that 3-year journey, we came out of it with our own set of values that are honesty, creativity, collaboration, and honesty. And honesty is the first one that I usually really lean into. And definitely for myself, my whole leadership style has changed from when we were a non-Indigenous business. I really learned how to move my way up my career ladder by really focusing on what worked best in the Western world of business. And for me, that was to hit a target at any price. Quotas were what I looked for. It was money over people, but it never felt right. So how did we balance out people and money? And so for us, really for me and my leadership style was then to start to learn to take a pause and really start to learn to listen. And so right now, building in the culture at Race Rocks, we have our own internal program. After we finished the 3 years of the beginning of the PAR program, we took that inside and we called it Aspire. And in Aspire, we learn a lot about Indigenous culture, but also all of the other cultures that are in Race Rocks or that are around Race Rocks and associated with us, to continue to grow that culture and to make sure that it's inclusive. Something that we really lean into in our people systems that we build at Race Rocks is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the diversity side of it is, we'll put a job posting out. We really want to attract Indigenous peoples to come work in tech careers. We know that there's not a large representation. We'll throw out a job description and we'll see what the candidate pool looks like. If it's not a large candidate pool coming back, we will then take it, revise it, and then try it again. Around the inclusion side of it is back to those internal programs where we're working together to figure out what does the culture look like today, because that culture is forever changing with what the team looks like at Race Rocks. And then the equity part of it is around our pay strategy. We spent the last 18 months working with a third party to ensure that our pay is transparent, that it's equitable, and that it's clear. What we also like to bring into that is we like to call it RDEI. We like to bring reconciliation into that. And maybe what I'll speak to a little bit further in the podcast is some of those programs. But right now, the one I'll talk to is Kishkeda, which is our Indigenous intern program. And that is, for me, around digital indigeneity, is how do we attract more Indigenous people to tech careers so we can continue to have this conversation, have more people at the table so there's a bigger diverse perspective on it so that we can move forward together.
Okay, wow! Like there's a couple podcasts here, Tommy, that we could dive a little deeper in some of this stuff.
I was literally just thinking the same thing.
So it's like a 3-year program you went through to kind of unpack and design and develop. That's amazing. I mean, that speaks in itself into, like, as an Indigenous company, how we rethink and redo business, right, and make the time and space to grow all that. I had a friend of mine reach out to me. He's not Indigenous, but he wants to do some work with Indigenous communities. And I said, one of the things I said to him, which was just to reflect the investment of time and energy, is you actually have to go out there and make contact with these folks.
Yes.
And then you have to go on the journey of relationship building. And that can take months, years to get there, and it's just that investment in time, and it's so wonderful to see that. And we, OneFeather, we our kind of manifesto is to have impact first, above everything else. That's the top of the list, and impact comes before profit. Profit comes, so we go through that whole process so that the organization understands exactly what our priorities are and what we're gonna, how we are going to do business as an Indigenous company. So I think what you've just shared, I think is inspiring, and I think it resonates. It certainly resonates with me, and so I think that's there's a I don't think you could probably design and launch a program now for as the teacher now in terms of how to be how to build an Indigenous enterprise. That's amazing. Well, awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Even though we've had conversations about entry points and building relationships with Indigenous communities, I still always find it interesting and wondering what the listener is hearing. So if you're a Canadian, non-Indigenous Canadian, and you're hearing this, it might seem kind of bizarre. If you're a business owner, why would you start working on the relationship first? Why can't you just send an email and block a spot in somebody's calendar and get down to making money? And there's like, I've always admired, I think is another way of putting this, Anita, that there's that the process of building relationships and establishing trust and rapport early is almost counterintuitive to that really aggressive late capital pursuit. And so it's really, really refreshing to hear this. And I start wondering about what this means in the context of an Indigenous company. But then I also get really curious, even more so, about what it means from the perspective of defense and aerospace training. Could you talk a little bit for us, if you don't mind, about how these values translate into educating people that work in defense for Canada? This is really, really fascinating, and certainly a first for us.
Yeah, Steph, I can actually speak to it, but I really want to start out with saying that we're just getting started. Mm-hmm. So to bring Indigenous perspectives into the aerospace and defense sector is something that is just at its infancy stage. We are not, even moving forward yet in actionable terms. So definitely one thing that I do sit on, and this is a mouthful, I sit right now with a group that's called the Defense Industry Advisory Group, Indigenous Procurement Working Group. And our mandate is to attract Indigenous businesses and communities to defense procurement. We also want to work together to remove some of those barriers that are making procurement inaccessible. So the first stage in that is identifying, some of those barriers. But when I say that the Indigenous perspective is at the beginning stage, it's because to really have an impact back to reconciliation and back to creating that relationship, we need to have a seat at the table. And what does that mean? We can't come in after the fact and say, this policy doesn't work for us. This is how we would help you change it. We need to be sitting at that table so that we're helping with the defense planning, the strategies, and the collaboration and affecting those policies that are creating those barriers for Indigenous businesses and communities. And so the group that sits on this board, this group with me, is government. It's Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses. It's Indigenous and non-Indigenous associations. And so together we are having great conversation, but again, we are only at that conversation place. And to actually take action, we need again to be back at that table when the planning is happening so we can help influence the Indigenous participation in these larger government programs and contracts.
It's such a unique perspective that you have as an Indigenous technology leader. And how are you ensuring through the work that you do? And I'm thinking from a digital perspective here. So AI, new technologies, emerging technologies, very powerful tools that are just, that are dropping on us, that we can use for good or for bad. And from an Indigenous perspective, from your perspective particularly I think as an Indigenous woman, how does that translate for you in terms of empowerment rather than continued marginalization?
Right now, working with the Royal Canadian Navy, we train technicians and operators. Mm-hmm. And through that, the DIAG, Indigenous Procurement Working Group program that we're sitting on, we have spun off a pilot program with the Canadian Coast Guard, CANDO, and Suk Nation, and another small, medium-sized business in technology on the island. And so what I would like to see is the training that's provided to the Royal Canadian Navy also provided to the Indigenous coastal nations. And what that means is, but also after that training is provided, is how do we then go and capture the Indigenous knowledge, history, and culture to include that in that training, to make that more inclusive, and then also to reach a wider audience. One part that is just announced lately was the Defense Policy Update. And they're calling in that to coastal nations to help to defend the North when the threat arrives in 5 years.
Okay.
How are we going to do that?
Right.
We know that coastal nations have been on the water for thousands of years.
Right.
They know environmental stewardship. They know how to safely navigate those waters, and including being respectful to the marine life. That is where we need to start. We need to collect that training, take it together, provide it alongside the D&D training, the Transport Canada regulatory stuff that needs to be there, and then also include in it this Indigenous perspective so that it's a fulsome training program.
Yeah. I'm going to let Tommy go, but I guess what I want to see is the follow-up question after Tommy's is, what's the readiness of our people to embrace those technologies and be a part of that process?
I was going to ask something almost exactly the same. Is the extent to which some of these Indigenous communities in the coastal regions are capable and ready to have these conversations, and how much you imagine that they will continue to consult and be contacted as the process unfolds over time. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about this. This is really interesting.
And definitely, and as Indigenous woman in a company that's in aerospace and defense, I know that there's lots of areas out there where I'm definitely don't have the experience and I don't have the education to answer some of these questions or to actually start some of these conversations. So that's where I definitely take a step back and I look out to who can I work with, who's already doing this great, and how can I support them? And that's where CANDO, the relationship with CANDO, their mandate is the economic development officers here who know the nations across Canada. They know their capacity and they know their capability and they know what opportunities today they are ready to look for and the opportunities of the future. So for me, it's definitely taking that step back to say, where are we now and how do we move forward together? When we started the Indigenous Mariner Training Program, halfway through, for me, it was almost a full stop because in government programs, a lot of times we will follow the money. It doesn't mean that we are actually following the right impact or the right outcome. We're following the money. And sometimes you need to do that to get to that next phase, which is what actually did come out and happen. But we had honest conversation where we were able to throw our hand up saying, I don't see the outcome on this when it's right now the technology is being placed in a certain area. And right now we're working with one nation who we know has the ability they have the infrastructure and they also have the training services. So they can actually move on this opportunity. What does it look like for all of the other coastal nations across Canada? So for me, it's definitely finding those associations or those other groups or those other businesses or communities out there that are doing something really well, having that open, respectful conversation saying, how can we support you?
Fascinating. I'd imagine that the vehicle for delivering training, especially in this kind of late pandemic space, for lack of a better terms, at least maybe this era, is done. It's delivered digitally, and so I'm wondering: has there been a moment, an example, maybe an anecdote, a story that you could share with us about a time where a value or a logic from one of these coastal communities helped shape or mold one of these conversations to provide one of those aha moments for one of the Canadian counterparts at the table during a conversation?
Yes, if I understand the question correctly, for me, it was, we ran a pilot program, and again, it was Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses and associations and communities. And for me, when I saw the video that was spun up afterwards to showcase and highlight it, I saw very little Indigenous representation. I saw very little impact that was supposed to be provided to the Indigenous communities. And so for me, that was a miss. And that was another time, definitely, I threw my hand up and said, this isn't what I signed up for. And so, can we take a step back and really figure out exactly where we're going so that all parties are in the know, and then we can decide or not decide to be on board.
And that, I think that's, I mean, that's the real demonstration, reflection of having a seat at the table, right? To say, hey, this does not fit. This does not align with our values. This does not capture the messaging that we had agreed on. We need to go back to the drawing board and start over again because we've missed the target here, right? And if you weren't there, everyone would have celebrated this great production, and Indigenous people on the sidelines be going, what was that all about, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, Lawrence, but sometimes it's really hard to be that person in the room. It's really hard because I did see, it did have some wins. It did have some really great outcomes to it. Yeah. But the overall outcome for me, and maybe I hadn't, my learning from that was maybe I hadn't clearly articulated that when we started and why I was coming along.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, absolutely, and I mean, and I'm sure you experience this all the time. I do, and it's always. I feel like a broken record most of the time in terms of the conversations I'm having with our partners, federally in particular, but even provincially, and just reminding folks of that. That the Indigenous messaging around values and the way we do business comes from a lived experience, a shared learning. From that Indigenous lens, and it's very different. And folks just often need to be reminded. I mean, they're receptive, but our whole world is full of our own biases. So things happen, people have ownership of pieces, and the next thing you know, you're way off track in terms of what's supposed to be happening. So you've got to be constantly kind of like that wedge. It's like, okay, this is good, but it could be better if it looked this way. Right? Yeah,
it's a privilege that I think that so many people that you get to work with get to encounter what it means to perform in a way that's reflexive and self-aware, because in 99% of the encounters that I'm imagining and out of my experience, the Indigenous aware attitude or agenda for a non-Indigenous person, it never exists. It usually starts with a land acknowledgement that is provided by a CSR officer or something, and it's added as a footnote in an email. And so I think for people like yourself, Anita, and Lawrence, and virtually all of our guests in the past, there's always this extra level setting that has to take place that sounds really, really onerous. And without it, and without having conversations like this, non-Indigenous people in Canada never really become aware that this is a problem. And yet it's still a lot of heavy lifting. And so where I'm going with this is I'm trying to understand how this fits in really, really rigid institutions. Like I've heard you both talk about government, but military is a particularly interesting kind of institution to deal with. And so I'm just curious, and we don't have to include this in the episode, Anita. This is something that might be too out of bounds, and you can just tell me and then it won't show up, and that's no problem. But I'm curious about like what you think are 2 or 3 things that any kind of military institution or aerospace institution anywhere in the world could do better. Like what would those 2 or 3 things look like for you?
I would say getting to know the Indigenous communities and businesses that are in close proximity to the base, the Navy base, the Air Force, wherever they're placed, wherever their runways and their hangars are and their training facilities, is really getting to know the local Indigenous communities and nations and businesses. And I would think maybe the way we look at stuff is everything is set in stone. And so right now we know, as we talked earlier, we need to start creating this relationship. And that relationship needs to start so that we can build trust. And I think if we don't actually reach out and know those people, basically know our neighbors, how would you even know what kind of opportunity would potentially be available for the individuals? And so that's starting with that relationship and then building sort of that trust into that. And from the trust is then you can start having that collaboration kind of conversation. And that's when you can have some strategic parts to it too. But part of that also is the risk. Any relationship you go into, there's going to be risk. And I think right now, the military is really nervous about working with Indigenous business and communities because of that risk. Procurement is very locked down. There's no room in it really for error. But when you step into a relationship with an Indigenous business or community and you haven't done your own research, you are stepping into a risky conversation. And what does good look like? And so for me, I really think it starts with doing your own research around who's around you, what's there, what's to offer, and then starting those relationships, but having an open mind in those conversations, because knowing that you're going to handle and hold some of that risk. And that's how I think you can really move forward together in a good way. But without that, individuals first taking that step back to say, what do I own in this? And what part of this do I need to start on my own? Without that, we're not going to get anywhere.
It's complex, this relationship, right? And we're just talking about the historical relationship between Indigenous people and government and military, for example, or just powerful forces, right? We haven't really talked anything about the emergence of new technologies and AI and that kind of stuff, and what kind of role how that's impacting us. But those relationships. So, I mean, is there a conversation that happens when you're sitting at the table? Are you reminding folks of that there's a trauma-informed reality here that has to be part of the conversation? And what good looks like is not solving all those problems, but at least being open to the conversation and allowing Indigenous people to be heard, right? Because that narrative is so important. And the first part of that relationship is just feeling like you can be heard and acknowledge that these things happened, and not just brush them off as like, well, that was my great grandfather. That has nothing to do with me. Sure, but it's a legacy that still exists, right?
Yes, and I think that right now, a lot of that education is out there, and potentially some of it is being acted on.
Right.
But I think that, to be completely honest with you, I think that the Western world of business, it almost would need that rolled into the process at the very beginning of it. this is how you go out and start. Before you start this process, you need to go out and have this engagement. You need to go out there and see what the art of the possible is.
Right.
And then you need to work together and also, ask, is this the opportunity you want? Where are you going into the future? And how can we also support you to get there? Yeah. Right now, it's very one directional. It's, we have this opportunity. Do you want it? Or we are going to create this opportunity. How are you going to action it? Right now, I hear it all the time. There's not capacity. There's not capability. And so my response back is, well, if there isn't, how are we going to grow it?
Yeah.
And then the conversation usually ends because it's very cut and dry. It's very black and white. And where it's not, because the only way that we can move forward together is if we start together. And we know that this process is where we weren't included in the process. Plus there's a lot of distrust already. So I'm not sure, unless we actually roll back that process and include it in the very beginning, this is how to create a relationship. I'm not sure how we're going to move forward in a positive way or have any meaningful impact.
Yeah. A lot of work to do there yet. Yeah.
Tons of work.
In some senses, the show has just been, so focused and zeroed in on the digital side of digital indigeneity. I mean, explicitly, that's what we've been focusing on. But in a lot of ways, our conversation is really unique here because it's forcing us to rewind and go back and unpack some things that may have been laden with biases and assumptions, whether it's by virtue of the fact that I'm here as a white Anglo-Saxon heteronormative male from London, Ontario, Canada, or for the listener, because we have stacked some really, really big institutions together. And so what I'm learning and listening to you now is that there's a bit of a process here for establishing trust. There's a process here for building relationships, especially in domains and sectors and walks of life in and around Turtle Island that have a lot of really, really high stakes with a lot of long-standing historical legacy.
Tommy, you framed it well. I mean, we've had this conversation, and there's a history here, there's a nuance here, there's a whole bunch of important elements that need to be considered, and then we layer on this, the increasingly prevalent and here in the now, growing so quickly and fast AI and the tools that are associated with that, and the impacts that one of the things that I'm really concerned about is if Indigenous people aren't leading the conversation around what these tools mean and how they're going to be used and what our voice is at that table, that it's going to take on another form of colonialization, another form of marginalization, another form of oppression and discrimination against Indigenous people. And so I that's something that really, really concerns me. And so it's really such a breath of fresh air on this podcast, is because we visit and we talk with Indigenous people who are at the forefront here, whether they realize it or not. They are having that conversation. They're at the table. They are leading that. So that gives me lots of pause for like celebration and okay, we got this. And so I guess the quick question is, what does that mean to you, Anita? This emergence of technology, AI, the impacts it's having in the world. How are you? What does that mean to you? How are you preserving that, or how are you having that narrative, that conversation around what it means to be Indigenous in that space?
It's a really good question. I struggle with this answer, to be honest with you. I have seen technology. I started my career in the early 90s, just so that I can give you some sort of breadth to it. And I love technology. I am an accountant. That is my background. But I was introduced to technology very early in my career. Mm-hmm. And I'll take a little step back further from that. And I'm not sure this is going to answer your question, but when I was younger, I wanted to have a family and a career. And for a woman back then, that was a very difficult thing to have in the early 90s. So my first thing was what career could I have that I potentially could still have a career and a family? An accounting designation was the first thing that came to mind. From that early, I saw technology affect the accounting sector, and I saw how easy it made it and how much more information came out of the data. And from that, I got an opportunity to work with one of the first tech startups here on Vancouver Island. And from that, I got to see two individuals in the entrepreneurial world. So for me, I saw it as opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I always, until recently, saw technology as creating that opportunity. Taking a task that you do or working with a tool that you use and making everything more effective and more efficient. Mm-hmm. More time to sit back and work on strategy, more time to sit back and make sure that what you're doing is exactly what you want to be doing. So for me, where the future of tech is going and how Indigenous people play a role in that, for me, the only way I can answer that question is to attract more Indigenous people to tech careers.
Right.
So that not only do we have a seat at the table, we are creating our own tables. We are then together moving that forward in the way we want to move it forward. Mm-hmm. So really for me, it's that ownership. Let's step forward. Let's own this together as an Indigenous tech group, mm-hmm. as we are doing with the Indigenous Tech Circle, mm-hmm. areas like that. That for me is where I lean in to say, how are we going to affect the future of technology? Personally, I don't know, but together, I know we're going to come up with a great opportunity.
Yeah. Oh, well, at least we'll be in the soup, right? Figuring it out.
For me, it's, I find that if we could it's even around defense for me, it's one of my mandates is an Indigenous defense supply chain. I said that to someone that's an ally back in 2022, and they fell off their chair laughing. 2 years later, it's something that people are starting to sort of float. They're starting to kind of talk about it. And so for me, again, it's where do we start today? How do we start those conversations so that these big, crazy, audacious goals can become something that we can see in 2 to 3 years?
Absolutely. And I think it's so fair. I mean, I think it's fair because I agree. It's like, we just got to get in there and do the work, right? We just got to get in there and do the heavy lifting and do it in a way that makes sense for us in the space that we're in, the work that we're doing. And you mentioned earlier, right at the very beginning of the podcast, the Kishkaita program. Is that how you say that? Did I say that correctly? Kishkaita program.
Yeah.
Where you aims to bring in more Indigenous students into this career space, right?
Yes.
So that's a perfect example of that. And we're all doing our part to kind of, navigate that and figure out as we go. How do you invite young people into that space? Like, do you ready them for that? Or like, what does that entry look like? Do you have conversations with them about technology, or is it around the career? Or is it like, do you go deeper with them? Do you have conversations around that with your students in that program, or even just with your staff around, we're doing these things, and I don't want people to lose sight of the deeper meaning of what we're trying to do here from a technology management perspective, if you like, from an Indigenous kind of influence perspective. Like, what does that conversation look like for you when you're out there in the world doing your thing?
Oh no, that's really great. And we've had tons of conversation around this. And for me, first of all, it's asking for the permission. Mm-hmm. It's when we have our Indigenous students come in, it's asking them permission. Mm-hmm. How far do you want us to go? What questions do you want us to talk to you about? And at any time in this conversation, if you feel uncomfortable, you just need to say it, and we can change the conversation. And so for me, it's really, and then learning those lessons from, did that work for you? You came in and you worked with us 3 months. We checked in. We run the Aspire, which is run quarterly. They potentially get to be involved in some of our culture at Race Rocks, some of the different areas that we work with around creating sort of more of that family feel inside the mm-hmm. business. And then also what they're learning and, does it apply to them, and then also though giving them that time to speak to, if they want to, where they come and where they want to go. Yeah. And then that question is how do we support you to get there? And so really it's more, again, it's a back and forth mm-hmm. where I think in the past, it's been more of we've got this great program for you. We're going to bring you in and we're going to teach you all this stuff. And then you're going to go off and you're going to have learned all this amazing information that you can apply in your studies and in your future careers. Where now it's like, actually, what do you need? Mm-hmm. And what a lot of times it's maybe you need that co-employee that supports you in different areas.
Right.
What does that employee need to look like? I've had lots of conversations with Plato Software Testing. Yeah. I know that they have a phenomenal internship program and all of their lesson learned. Again, it's asking those questions. I love to ask questions. And the reason I'm asking questions is so that we can continue to do something better and learn from other people's mistakes, but then leverage all of those great learnings where there's been opportunity.
Yeah. Amazing.
What are sort of the memorable questions that you get asked from your young people when you're training, especially from Indigenous people?
I would say that I've been recently, in the last year, I was at a Indigenous Tech Circle conference where we invited young Indigenous entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And we sat in circle, and we had a bunch of Indigenous people that were further along in their tech careers sort of talk about some of the barriers that they had seen and some of the barriers that they had sort of taken, had removed. I'm so inspired by our younger generation, because being later in my career, a lot of times I don't think I know the problems that they have coming in. So I don't know how to work and support those problems unless I actually have that conversation with them. So for me, in this conference, the space was created for these younger Indigenous entrepreneurs to ask these really great questions. And one of the questions actually that really knocked me off my chair was how they could create space for another Indigenous person to be elevated.
Right.
And that blew me away, that the younger generation is that observant, that it isn't just individual that we're going to may recognized and be moved forward, it's collective. And I don't come from an era of that. I come from an era of self. And so to listen to Indigenous youth that want to get into entrepreneurial careers or tech careers to say, how do we work in this space collaboratively and more of as a collective, to me was one of the best questions I was asked.
And this is a question coming from a young person, and I'm wondering, are these the kind of questions that you find are resonating with big Canadian institutions as well? Does that also make people in the military and federal government that you work with pause and say, hey, that's kind of interesting?
Definitely, because I always share it with them.
That's right. Good. Or it probably feels like sometimes, let me just bang you over the head again with this one more time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it is. And I say that to them. I say, have you listened? When was the last time you listened? When was the last time you went to a conference that wasn't focused on what you're doing? It was focused on potentially something that maybe a couple careers down from where you're at, or maybe a career that could segue into where you're at. When was the last time you went and you heard what those next generations that are coming up, what they want, what they need, what they're looking for, what makes them feel seen and heard? And I don't think that we do that enough. And so, I'm challenged at my age sometimes to think, am I still relevant? I know I have a ton of experience, but does that experience still relate back to creating that right opportunity for those next generations? And the way I've been able to bridge that myself is to take myself out of where I'm at and go into those conversations with those younger generations and ask them, and then actually stop talking and listen.
It's great advice. And just hearing you say that out loud, it reminds me that most of us probably don't take the time to properly create a pause in our lives to go and look. I think your analogy there is someone who's, several levels not achieved in terms of your status or your career, to see where they're at in that process and understand how they can find their way and what's important to them, because that's such great advice and guidance. And I think for anyone, even as a parent or as a boss, let alone being leaders in this space, for sure. Yeah, that's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Definitely. And I can honestly tell you, even at my career where I'm at now, I don't know that I would have ever asked that question.
Yeah.
How do I lift someone else up? How do I create space for them? And so, very grateful.
What kind of questions do you think should be asked 20 years from now? What does a hard-hitting question look like if we look way down the road?
It's a powerful question in the sense that, when I think about the work that we do at OneFeather and in some of the technologies we're incorporating and using, and a focus on providing solutions in a digital space. Like, that's where we're focused. We want to reimagine that interface between Indigenous people themselves, institutions, government, and just society. So wherever there's friction based on that history or that trauma, or even just systems or processes or institutions that are biased or racist because of that history or because of however they were designed, we can reimagine those things in a new digital way, using digital technologies to reimagine those. And so the thing I struggle with all the time is how do we do that from an Indigenous lens and through that Indigenous lived experience and that perspective? And the one thing that I always fall back on, or the one thing I always reflect on, Tommy and Anita, and Tommy in particular, but it's that podcast we did with Chief Bobby Joseph. And he said just to go out there and do the work, do it, be the digital warrior, go out there and explore boundaries, find new opportunities, do different things, new things. And he said all the cautionary part to that, or the responsibility, is to come back and or to always be having, or that ongoing dialogue or conversation with Indigenous people to make sure that it's relevant, that it matters, and that it's in fact the right thing to do. Because as individuals, we may have a sense of what's good or what's right, and it could be timing, could just be the technology itself, it could be the instance. But if we're getting it wrong, they'll tell us we're getting it wrong. But you have to create space for that conversation and for those questions to be had. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question. So I feel, Anita, some of this, but I don't always know the answer to the question specifically, other than to say that I don't know what the questions will be, but it's important that we make space for the questions.
And I think maybe that's where it could become a norm, right? Where we don't have to create the space anymore, because the space is just created as part of the norm. And how do we start that? I mean, so what do we do today to ensure that those questions are answered 20 years from now, is what I would ask myself.
Yeah.
And
I see.
And for me, it's definitely, as a technology leader, what kind of groups do I surround myself with like thinkers like Lawrence, and how together do we come up with ways of walking it instead of just talking it? So that it's not just that we are out there shouting about it. People are seeing us actually in action, and then they're coming along with us. And that means that they're not just coming along with us, they're influencing that next step we take together. So for me, it would really be about the walking of it, alongside the talking of it, which then shows that positive impact.
I'm hopeful that, Anita, you could take us out of this podcast by, I think, just a little bit more on looking ahead and how you envision technologies and the work that you do, particularly aerospace and military space. What does that future hold, and what are you excited about?
Yes. Oh, thank you. Definitely. Looking at training and technology-enabled learning is for us to attract, again, back to Indigenous people to tech careers, to help us build that training. And for me, when I talk about digital indigeneity, in a training space, it's really about storytelling. And back to the Indigenous roots, where knowledge was transferred to generation through storytelling. And how do we incorporate that into the training so that those stories are continued on? They also now have a digital feel to them, where the next generations can apply their own learnings to that. And so that the learnings don't just come from the past, which we're hoping we can still recover and save, but also that those learnings continue to grow. And every decade we have new challenges, we have new opportunities. What do we always learn from the past? But then again, what have we learned in the current that we can take together into the future?
The important kind of core messaging from you is making space for training and Indigenous people to be participating and involved. In your Kishkaida program, in order for Indigenous people to have a voice and participate in this digital indigeneity, or this digital economy, or this digital world, we need to make space for them to participate and actually be involved. I mean, I think that's the powerful or core part of what I've heard you say. And I want to just celebrate and applaud that, because it reminds me that we're all going to have a role to play in this, and some of us are going to be masters at creating that space, and I think you are certainly one of them, and I think we're so fortunate to have you doing that, and I just raise my hands to you for that. It's great messaging today and powerful work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to say that I've experienced this. I was welcomed by the Indigenous economy. I was welcomed by Indigenous groups. I can definitely speak to that with Lawrence. I can speak to that with Jeff Ward, that wherever I have walked into a room where there's been other Indigenous people that are working in technology, they have opened the space for me to come in and join the conversation. And for me, that has elevated how I can speak about digital indigeneity in other groups. And it also has given me the confidence that I'm not the only one out there looking for this, so that actually then it actually gives it that tick to go, I'm going in the right direction, even though at times very difficult.
This has been a really, really special process and experience for both of us.
Absolutely. Just lovely. Thank you, Anita.
Oh, thank you too. Honestly, I it was to see the invitation come through. Again, it was one of those moments where you're just grateful, and you belong to a group of people that are going in the same direction as you. And I want to say how grateful I am for that. Thank you.